And thank you very much, Catherine, and to the AHS for having me here tonight, and to you all for being here. It's a great honor, I say that. Coming from Santa Fe, Tucson is like New York City. So please forgive me if I seem like a country folk out here in a big city. So I want to talk about a place that gets talked about all too much. Probably all sick of hearing about Chaco Canyon. How many people have been there? Yeah, everybody. Okay, you've heard it all from the Park Service then. Just kidding. So, Canyon, northwest New Mexico, not a particularly hospitable place. Well, it depends who you ask, but soil analysis shows not a great place to grow corn, very salty, not a lot of rainfall, temperature extreme, short growing season, etc., so on. And yet, people were drawn here in the ancient past to construct monumental architecture. You see here Pueblo Bonito, largest building in North America until the 1800s, over 800 rooms, 4 stories tall. You've heard the story before. A building who I would say that time depth is really not appreciated on. These are maps and models done by my mentor and colleague Rich Friedman, San Juan College, who shows the building developing so we get a sense of the immense effort put into constructing these great houses. So, in the 800s, Pueblo Bonito starts out as an arc with some kivas outside, fairly typical Pueblo One thing you might find in the northern San Juan region. And it just grows. You see here getting up to multiple stories, and you can see the little people in there. I don't have the laser pointer, but they're like ants. And grows. And then this craziness happens. And then we finish here at stage 5. So I just think these models very useful for getting a sense of, you go today and the building overwhelms you as a ruin, but to see in 3D just the immense scale of labor put into these things. And so, of course, the question that has fascinated me and many, many others before me, and certainly many people after me, is what was so inspiring to construct on this scale, to construct this type of architecture that is beyond what you need for living. I mean, you go to any of these communities, there's unit pueblos, humble things people are living in, and then you get the monumental great house with these soaring walls and thick, thick walls. You've all seen this. And it wasn't just Pueblo Bonito. In the canyon, you have many different great houses built on this massive scale. So I really like this map showing these. And along with the great houses, you have roads. Not just a little pathway going down the canyon, but 30 feet wide, rigorously straight. These are roads that we've been using in my work with the Solstice Project. We've been using LiDAR in the past few years to document roads and Chacoan landscapes, and they're everywhere, and they're huge, and then you go out in the field and there's a line of shirts following them. But I bring up the roads because the effort to construct those, along with the great houses, is incredible amount of work. So there have been other, some clues into what was special that's going on in this society. One of them has to do with today. What is today? It's the equinox. So happy equinox to everybody. But if you were in Chaco Canyon, these are 2 things that would have been seen in the past. On the left, you see the rock art site on Fajada Butte known as the Sun Dagger, and small spiral to the left of the main spiral that marks the solstices is perfectly bisected by a dagger of light on the 2 equinox days. And this is a picture I took back 2 days before the fall equinox. So as Anna put it, it's wonderfully off, because if I'd been there 2 days later, that sun would be setting directly in line with that wall. So certainly, we get a sense that part of what was so inspiring and powerful at Chaco was this knowledge and this display of astronomy. Here you have Tetrachetl. We took this picture 2 years ago, the year of the minor standstill, when the moon was rising perfectly in line, and then 6 months later, at its summer extreme, setting perfectly in line in the other direction. So that's another aspect of these buildings and the society. Another thing that's fascinated people and is wonderful is the amount of material that was sucked into Chaco, drawn in. So I just put these three things on the slide here. You have timbers, estimates, 220,000 for great house construction carried in by foot from up to 50 miles distant. You're not getting ponderosas and tall beams like this thrown in the canyon, as well as much of the stone. This you see here, some Narbona Pass chert used for making stone tools carried in from these great distances of the Chusca slopes, and over half of the utilitarian pottery as well. So there's a lot coming into Chaco Canyon, but of course some people might have slightly different ideas, but there is not any great consensus on something that's going out, say a corresponding export, aside from, I like how Colin Renford put it, the export being powerful religious experiences, something immaterial. And so whatever it was that was being experienced or quote unquote exported was powerful, and it spread across a vast region up as close to St. Patrick's Day. So I put Ireland on the upper left here, and you see that the region of Chaco outliers, so communities throughout the American Southwest that replicated great house architecture, is twice the size of Ireland. And then we have it compared to, rough extents of Aztec civilization, Maya civilization. It's really on scale with some of the great cultural systems of the Americas. And I'll come back to this later, but this is a site out, the easternmost Chaco outlier, Guadalupe, and you've got pretty typical situation of a great house up on a high point or a massive, two-story building at least up there. And the other red arrow is showing the sort of, field houses, what people are living in. That is, to me, to my eye, a clear example of some people have, or a lot of power, or there's a place where power is concentrated in the society, and then there are more sort of common dwellings, common situations. So that's what's being shown here. So, like all of us, I was wondering what is going on at Chaco, what was so fascinating to these people living throughout this region that would draw in the labor, the importation of goods to fuel this monumental society in the canyon. And so while studying at Brown, there's sort of a movement within Mediterranean archaeology in particular, where it's called the archaeology of the senses. Scholars looking at different ways that sensorial experience of textures and smells and sights and sounds can be, I don't want to say glimpsed, because we talk about the overemphasis on the visual in archaeology, but can be reached in the past. And so I thought I would attempt applying this archaeology of the senses approach to Chaco Canyon. And specifically, what was it that was, what would I apply it to? And it was the Mesoamerican exotica that you've all probably heard about. Objects that were brought into Chaco from great distances, and I began thinking about it. What was so special about these things? Well, there's many aspects, but I think a principal one that hadn't been discussed at much length was these objects' striking sensory characteristics. As I say here, bizarre, striking, novel sounds, sights, and tastes. And going along with this, Tim Poketot and others have talked about the real agency that objects and things that we don't think of as exerting a very profound influence on society can have. So you might call this object agency, or the fact that if you've never seen a talking bird that has 6 colors on it before, and suddenly it's popping out of the cliff wall, that bird is exerting a real force, a real agency, just as a human who is particularly charismatic or whatever would have a sort of agency. So also, within anthropological literature, there's an idea among many traditional societies, call them tribal societies, whatever you will, across the world, that you define your group's territory and you have a well-defined cosmos, your world. Anything beyond those limits is seen as dangerous, but also a potent source of power. So what Mary Helms, who documented this situation cross-culturally, talked about is there's people within societies called long-distance specialists within these traditional societies who will go out into that unknown, beyond lands, talked about, mythic lands, and for them to come back and bring with them objects from these places that are imbued with these supernatural associations, they acquire great status and great power, such that physical distance is mapped then onto a symbolic or a supernatural dimension. And then, of course, that the objects that come back then are enchanting or imbued with a true magic. And we even see this in our world today, bringing back exotic goods from faraway lands. They have a certain allure to them. So I began to think about what might be called quote-unquote ritual objects or exotica from Chaco Canyon in this light. So the first object type that I became interested in was turquoise, not coming from that far away, but Cerrillos mines, which are the closest turquoise source to Chaco, still pretty far away, about 100 miles. And what is it about turquoise that is special if you're thinking of the sensory characteristics? Well, one thing you would think of immediately is the color, right? Where do you see that sort of blue-green color within the Southwest? Well, you see it in the sky, the blue, you see it in the water as the blue, and the more green color you see as plants emerging out of the earth. So it's therefore no surprise, I would say, that many indigenous Southwestern cultures and just in our minds, we would associate the stone with water and with fertility. There's also strange aspects such that if you have a very blue piece of turquoise, the more you wear it and it contacts your skin, the greener it will become, part of the chemical reaction. Almost as if you have water that over time is germinating into a green plant. So interesting to think about this stone, which is the color of things that are shifting and moving and growing. Plants and water are not stable, solid elements. Yet turquoise takes that which is moving, that which is ephemeral, but it freezes it into a durable, workable material. And there have been scholars such as my professor Steve Houston who have talked in the Maya world about jade and blue-green stones as representing that among the Maya. Something ephemeral, shifting, and fertile, growing, frozen, made into a workable material, and that giving a special quality to that material, from shifting to workable. Of course, shells were also brought into the canyon from great distances, Gulf of California, freshwater shells from Texas, and of course the coast of Mesoamerica. Sometimes they might be, strung and probably worn on costumes to make a tinkler, something that makes a sound as you're dancing. Among, past Mesoamerican peoples and present indigenous peoples in the Southwest, that sound can be linked to rainmaking. We've all heard kind of shells tinkling together. And so I think that was probably one of the sensory aspects that was important about these objects, coming from far away, being related to water, but also, this sound that would be created through them being worn. And what's quite interesting, I think, related to that is that when you're hiking around the landscape of Chaco Canyon itself, there are fossilized remains of a watery past all throughout the landscape. So it's not uncommon to see patterns like this where it's almost as if the waves have become frozen into the sandstone. I can very easily imagine people quarrying stone to build those massive buildings, whack off a hunk of a rock, and there's a whole deposit of shells. And so people are, of course, wondering, what are these things frozen into the rock? And then suddenly you have leaders or special people, whatever you want to call them, at Chaco, who are able to bring these things, not frozen in the rock, but fresh, with stories of them coming out of the water, and that this relationship between the traces of a watery past frozen there in that canyon and what was able to be brought in this present time would have been a powerful demonstration of these people's connection to a place beyond. This is another picture of an incredible fossilized rock from Chaco Canyon. Of course, you've all probably heard the fantastic work of Dr. Patty Crown at the University of New Mexico, who for years scholars have looked at these on the far left, that's left for you guys too, the Chaco cylinder vessels, and Dorothy Washburn, Wolke Toll, they said, hey, these things look kind of like Mesoamerican cylinder jars. And if you read the glyphs on the Mesoamerican jars, they say cacawa, or chocolate, cacao. So Dr. Crown analyzed the residue, and lo and behold, they were holding chocolate. So in the Maya world, these things were used to pour cacao beverages from high up to create a frothed beverage. So if you think about that experience, that situation, one big aspect of it would be the sound. And that's the sound of a spring bubbling. That's the sound of a waterfall falling. That's the sound of rushing water, which of course, water is so important in this arid southwestern desert we live in. But also, the taste of cacao would be something strikingly new, and maybe there's a restricted set of people at a Chacoan gathering who are allowed to taste this new substance from the fertile, bright lands beyond. And we sometimes forget, because chocolate has become so ubiquitous in our modern American society, but it has, especially in a more concentrated form, it has a strong stimulant property on the brain, so that it's not caffeine, it's a chemical called theobromine, but imbibing this beverage also has an effect on your mental state. So the sensory experience of cacao is just out of this world. If you're living somewhere in that region of Chaco outliers, you know, if you believe people took pilgrimages to Chaco Canyon or whatever you believe, if those few people got a chance to see this being poured, hear it and taste it, and suddenly feel this new state, whoever was giving you that cacao is tied into a pretty special place. Copper bells brought up from the West Mexico. On the right, those aren't from Chaco, that's just an example of what ancient Western Mexican bells look like. But of course, the sound of these things, strikingly new. You don't have people working metal in the ancient Puebloan world. So you have a new sound, probably worn on costumes during dances, but also a whole new visual experience of something glimmering. And it's very interesting that in West Mexico, where the bells came into Chaco from, they were purposefully crafted in two hues of copper, so they played with the alloys. One of them was more of a golden color, one was more of a silver. And those two colors were purposely made to represent the sun and the moon. And astronomy, as the work of the Solstice Project has shown, was a central aspect of Chacoan society, and of course, in the world of the Pueblos today. So I think relating these bells, their sound, their glimmering quality, and also these two color associations to the sun and the moon, some of the interesting sensory aspects of those. Macaws, you guys get more of these down here in Arizona. But amazing bird, great work by Patricia Gilman talking about the process of carrying a macaw up from the jungles of Mexico to the Southwest. These birds bond to a single individual. And I've talked to a number of people who have had macaws as pets. They really bond to you. I know one person who had to get rid of his macaw. The macaw was so attached to him, it died within days of him breaking ties with the bird. So they really strongly cling on to one person. They're not very friendly to others. You know, they've been known to play with 2x4s and tear them apart with their claws. So, what else do we have with these birds? The colors, let's count the colors. Red, yellow, green, blue, white, black. That's 6 colors. Well, in the directional symbolism schema of the Pueblos, you've got 6 directions. Your cardinal, north, south, east, west, your zenith, and your nadir. And you get colors like red, yellow, blue, green associated with those 4 directions, white with up, black with down. So the bird has brought together all the directions into a single animal, almost as if it's a central bird. And of course, discussions of Chaco as a center place by Ruth Van Dyke and others colors are relevant, but this is the center bird. As if that wasn't enough, it talks. And we giggle, but I think it's an incredible thing. In Zuni, macaws were known to learn the names of people and learn words. So talk about a technology of enchantment. These birds are, you've got some at Solomon, got some at Aztec. They're really concentrated at Chaco Canyon. So there's this one place, monumental architecture, glimmering bells, making sounds you've never heard before. You suddenly get the sip of this stuff that's come from the jungles, and it's got you feeling amped up like I'm feeling right now because I'm nervous and I'm talking in Tucson. And then this bird comes out and it talks to you. Maybe it knows your name. Maybe it knows somebody else's name. I would probably build a great house for that. This shows here, this isn't from Chaco, but just to give it a sense of, or if we're sticking with the senses, to give a taste of the kind of costume might have been created with macaw feathers. Now, of course, too, there were musical instruments. Now, these aren't exactly, well, some of them are. So you see here a conch shell coming up from the south, and many of these were found with mouthpieces, turquoise encrusted. So again, you're bringing in that turquoise, that water. The shell itself comes from the water, and they make this, we've all heard conch shells blow a wonderful bellowing sound that in some indigenous Southwestern societies today is, the voice of different performers or deities in dances. And then flutes, of course, here, one with a frog carved on it coming out of Pueblo Bonito, creating wonderful airy music. And does anybody know what's shown here in the background, this piece of the cliff wall? So this is a section of cliff wall between Pueblo Bonito and Chetroketl that was, you can see there, that's all been carved out, all the rock removed, and it's created an amphitheater that amplifies sound and creates standing waves and has some acoustic properties the same as cathedrals in Europe. Great work by Richard Luce, John Stein, again, Rich Friedman have documented this, and they've gone out with different kinds of music and recordings so that if you're standing the right distance away and you've got the right rhythm of the music, they've described it as being bathed in sound because you get the standing wave coming off there, and it's incredible. And next time you go to Chaco, you'll see this between the two buildings. Just clap and you get wonderful echoes and reverberations. So anyhow, I just bring it up as an example of a place where these musical instruments could have been utilized and the music played. Maybe the macaws are shown off, the sound of the bells coming off the cliff wall, bathing you in sound. Truly a spectacular experience, such that you have a place like this, a desert environment, but when you have brought in all these goods from the tropics, goods with oceanic associations, bright birds, tinkling bells, I would suggest perhaps in your mind, if you were in a place that looked a little more like this. So to wrap up that aspect of what I've been thinking about, what was going on at Chaco that was so intriguing to people, so powerful? Well, using these objects in what I would say are sensory rituals, sensory performances, experiences that had the following associations: water and fertility, we saw with the turquoise; creation, the shells coming from an ancient past time. Kelly Hayes Gilpin has talked a lot about this concept of a flower world. I'm not trying to say Chaco was exactly the flower world as it was, say, among other places, Hohokam, but the flower world cosmology that's sung about in contemporary indigenous traditions and shown iconographically in ancient ones is a place filled with music, bells, and bright birds. So I think that fits. Maybe they weren't drawing it at Chaco or painting it on their pottery or in their rock art, but I think they were performing something like that. And of course, the solar and lunar astronomy that we remember today on the day of the equinox. So that's what I have to say about the sensory experience of Chaco Canyon. Now I'll turn to work that was conducted for my master's thesis last year at Brown University under the terrific leadership of Bob Purcell and John Sherry, which has to do with gambling. at Chaco Canyon. So we'll get to it. I was intrigued because I had heard many different oral traditions from both Pueblo and, well, we'll get to that in a minute, but both what we would call Navajo and Pueblo sides that described a lot of gambling happening in Chaco Canyon. I'll talk about the stories in a minute. But to me, it seems no problem that Native people know their own history. Some archaeologists seem to, and you gotta be critical, but Native people know their own history. So I heard all these stories describing gambling at Chaco, so I said, all right, let's see what more we can learn about it. I'm not here to say that's a made-up myth, because myth does not mean the way we use it in our culture of myth. Myth is something that combines history, metaphor, moral instruction, storytelling. It's all these things that we've separated out in our culture, wrapped into one, you might say, bundle. So there's ways you can go about this. Look at, if you have a bunch of oral traditions on a single theme, look for shared themes between them, shared episodes, shared characters, and try and extract back to what you might call a source version of the story, which is what I did for the Chaco gambling stories. Now, those in the room who have heard about the quote-unquote Navajo story of gambling at Chaco Canyon are going to say, hold up, hold up, hold up. Navajo didn't come to the Southwest until the 1500s. They have nothing to do with Chaco Canyon, so story's irrelevant. Which I think is, even if people aren't that explicit about it, I think has been sort of an implicit thought, because there's been very, very minimal attention to the Navajo gambler stories about Chaco. But there's a lot of evidence that whether, even if people from up far north who spoke a Athabascan Dene language migrated down around 1500, there's been so much interaction between Pueblo and Navajo peoples across the centuries that the categories we're using of Pueblo and Navajo are not, there are categories. And say a Navajo person would affiliate much more with a clan identity. And many of these Navajo clans in their origin stories state we originated at sites that we would call ancestral Puebloan or Anasazi sites. So what does that mean? Maybe it means that there were people living back then who eventually intermarried with migrants from the north. However you want to think about it, the fact is a lot of Navajo clans have very detailed stories detailing their origins at ancestral Pueblo sites. And there's been significant sharing between the two cultures, sharing of agriculture, ceramic technology. The Navajo origin story is just like the Pueblo origin story. It's not an Athabascan origin story. If you look at DNA, there's been a lot of intermarriage. Clan adoption, as I mentioned before, and then, of course, Pueblo people seeking refuge from colonial Spanish rule at different times. So whether it was during the Pueblo Revolt, which is somewhat of a contentious issue, or just at times when Spanish colonial repression of the Pueblos became strong, Pueblo people would go and take refuge with the Navajos. So there's been a lot of sharing, and for us to say it's a Navajo story, it has nothing to do with Chaco, I think has sort of blocked us from investigating a very interesting line of inquiry. So I'll now share this story briefly. The story tells that a very powerful individual came up to Chaco Canyon from the south. I'm not going to say his name because every time I do, something weird happens. And he was a skilled gambler. So he came to Chaco and the people in the surrounding region and he challenged them to gambling matches. And he always won. So the people, he was very skilled. In some cases, he was so skilled because he was the son of the sun, the celestial body that's halfway point today. So he challenged the people. First, they bet their goods. They lost all their goods. Then they bet their family members. They became slaves. And finally, the people had to bet themselves. They were enslaved by the gambler and forced to build the buildings, the great houses, carry the trees, etc., so on. Finally, the gods said, this has gone too far, this is not okay, you've got to be defeated. And so they created a perfect twin of the gambler, sent him down, and he challenged the gambler to all of his games beat him at each of them with the stakes increasing and increasing each time until finally the gambler was defeated, and the people wanted to kill him, but the gods said, no, you didn't like him because he was not a merciful person, so you need to be merciful. So what they did is, you can see in this drawing, which is from the Rock Point Navajo community, he was strung on a bow and shot up into the sky. Some cases he landed on the moon, which seems to have been a major obsession of Chaco. Other cases he shot back south to the south where he came from. And it said he was then seen again when he returned to the southwest as the god of the conquistadores. So that's the story. There's also other Pueblo stories I don't want to get too into, but they describe when the people were living at a location that's often linked to Chaco Canyon, known as White House, that there was one of the downfalls of the people there was excessive gambling, neglecting taking care of their fields, observing their proper, neglecting to observe their proper duties, and instead spending a lot of time gambling. So what I did is I took there's about 8 different versions of the story. Well, there's 10, but some of them came from the same person. So I got every version of the story told by a different person, wrote out note cards of every individual event that happened in every version, laid them out on my floor, had to take my bed out of my room because I had no more room, and I pulled out what were the shared themes from all the different versions, and there were enough shared themes that it was reasonable to conclude that there was a single older source version of this story that the subsequent iterations were derived from. Interestingly, so there were many shared themes. You know, the gambler always challenged people to gambling matches, for example. More than half the cases he came from the south. Many cases he addicted people to mind-altering drugs, so take that as you will. Datura grows a lot in Chaco. But the one theme that was shared among all of them is that he enslaved the people. So we'll get back to that later. But as you can see, when you begin to consider the themes of this story, there's many, many questions you could start asking. But I chose the simplest one. Is there archaeological evidence of gambling from Chaco Canyon in the form of gaming piece artifacts? And then, if there is, what functions might gambling have within a society? So I went to American Museum of Natural History, and I went to the Smithsonian Institution, where most of the, and down at University of New Mexico, Chaco Center, where those collections are held. And I was blown away because I documented 471 gaming pieces excavated from Chaco Canyon that have not really been discussed before. So I'll just sort of fly through them. We don't have to go through each piece with a lot of time, but the most common were these sticks. I mean, the diameters, super consistent, the lengths, you know, they vary by a centimeter or two maybe, and many, many up to 50, 60 of these things cached in a single room. And they look just like sticks that are used at Zuni in a race called the kickstick race that happens in the springtime and is associated with bringing moisture. And so, kicksticks. Hand game sticks, there were a lot of these shorter pieces, again, of very consistent lengths. They look like what a lot of, you know, ethnographically were used Native North American tribes in a game where you would hide one in your hand and kind of shuffle things around, and the other team has to guess which hand is the stick in. And then great amounts of wagering would happen on these games. All across, so I didn't say that, but across North America, Native North America, gambling was a huge practice. Not the way we think of it. Sometimes, and I'll get into this, but it had ceremonial implications, a way for people to exchange goods. So gambling was happening all over the continent. These, again, sort of cylinders. Here is a lot of very pretty bone dice, carved out of bone, usually unmarked on one side and incised with a regular, you know, set of motifs for marking on the other side. These are very interesting. Excuse me. All these ellipsoidal dice. So you see down here an ethnographic piece where peach pits would be taken out and one side blackened and the other side left unblackened, and they'd be rolled around in a dish or a tray. Because of the shape of these things, they always land one side up, and then you tally up the score. Well, these are from Chaco, the faunal people thought they were carved from bear femurs, the heads of bear femurs, and they're round and incised down the middle, and then one side marked, one side unmarked, and when you roll them around, they always land one side up, so they look just like these ethnographic pieces. These may be little counters or something, hard to know. A lot of wooden dice you see up there look just like the way ethnographic times Navajo people were making dice. And then worked shirts, you see at the bottom a sort of board game that was played at Zuni. Again, you know, could these be spindle whorl blanks? Yeah, sure, but they also could be used in multiple ways, and you see the Zuni pieces that were used in a gambling game, just like these worked shirts, again, painted on one side, blank on the other. And then these were very interesting. So there was a cache in Pueblo Bonito of things that have been called ceremonial sticks, and there's 4 different types, and I'm not saying they were all shinny sticks, but Pepper, the original excavator, drew a very strong connection where he said, if you look at type 3 sticks, and he has the whole idea that they were used in a golf-like shinny game played at Zuni. Shinny's played among all the Pueblos and really across North America. It was a very important game. Large-scale wagers, and even played as a form of divination where you'd have one team representing a wet year, one team representing a dry year, and the winners would determine where the corn would be planted that year. So not a trivial game. So it's not to say they're not quote-unquote ceremonial sticks, but these type 3 with these little golf club-like heads. You see the Zuni and the Isleta examples down here. I think it's quite likely were used in shinny matches. And in association with them were these kind of enigmatic-looking wooden pieces, but you look at ethnographic accounts of Native American gaming, well, there's a very common game where you have sort of a 2-ball connected thing and you toss it with a stick. And again, looks right on. So as I said, I documented 471 of these artifacts, and interestingly, the big cluster of them was up here in the oldest part of Pueblo Bonito, where most of the exotica, the very often talked about high status burials, the quote-unquote most ritual goods in the site were cached in that area, and that is also where there were big caches of gaming pieces. So okay, cool. But what does gambling have to do with Chaco? So maybe there's all these pieces and maybe there's the story, but does that get us anywhere with investigating the cultural dynamics at Chaco Canyon? I would say yes. So there's important social aspects of gaming. It's a great way of bringing people together. You look at that map of the Chaco world, across that huge region, it's pretty unlikely, I think, that people are speaking the same language. Yet they're probably coming together at times. For those villages to be demographically viable, people would have to be seeking mates outside of their village. So some kind of mechanism for bringing these people together for exchanges of goods and marriage partners, information, social connections were needed. Gambling is a great way. You can interact with others. It's extremely fun. It's extremely exciting. Might even be addicting. You don't need the same language if you all learn the rules of the game. So, interesting example, any anthropologists or anthropology students or anthropology enthusiasts in the room have probably read Clifford Geertz's account of the Balinese cockfight, which is an incredibly important social gathering where social rivalries are played out and competition is displayed through gambling matches, which is an excellent example. And it's also interesting to note that in the documented ethnographic accounts of gambling in North America, the high-stakes games took place between villages rather than within villages. So it was very common for villages to play against each other. And the reason you might not want to play against people in your own village is because it's very easy for conflicts to arise when you essentially steal someone's goods by winning them in a gambling match. So again, I just showed a map to say this is what, there's probably many ways that Chacoans developed, I like using the phrase, a social technology to bring people together for these interactions and exchanges, but I think gambling is an excellent one. There's also these ceremonial aspects that I was talking about earlier. So what is gambling? It's about chance. In our culture, we call it chance or luck, but with another worldview, that's directly You're going one-on-one with the gods, how your dice land, or how your outcome, what outcome you have. And so by attempting to control or influence or having great skill or great luck in gambling matches, you develop a sort of divine quality. So this is probably why among the Pueblos and many other North American tribes, gambling was a form of divination. The use of dice and the use of these games was a form of divination because it's all up to what we would call chance, but in another view, that's the gods or divine favor. And many of these games are associated with bringing rain. So the kickstick races I talked about, or it's said that at one of the Pueblos, the dice game was found to be so effective in bringing rain, they established an entire society just to play the dice game in the Kiva. So you wonder if maybe there were special matches happening in Chaco that would, divine things for the year, what the weather might be, or war divinations, or whatever it might be. And that perhaps some group had special luck, or cheating, or special skill, whatever it might be. And when I look at those great houses, it says to me, somebody knew how to win. I was talking to some Iroquois people who I was telling about this research, and they said, oh, we still play a gambling match to decide who's going to be the leadership that year. We got to learn what they were doing in Chaco to keep winning. So I thought that was funny. I'll probably skip over this. This is just an account from a Zuni kickstick race about the amounts that were bet. Ponies, sheep, goats, money, beads, bracelets, all are wagered. And again, it relates to the unpredictability of the natural world. This was Chaco 2 summers ago, when it was a lush, wonderful paradise, and you go there another year in the summer and the rains have not been good. It's just like throwing the dice. But if you can associate your skill or your luck with gambling matches with things like this happening, that's showing a lot of special connections, like being able to bring back a macabre. Now, it's also an excellent economic means of redistributing goods. So these are, picture here, Hadza hunter-gatherers from Tanzania, who usually they're off in small bands, but they come together once a year into big camps. And during that time, almost all of the men's time is spent gambling with each other. Much, much more time than is spent collecting food. And this is the way that they redistribute goods throughout the different peoples. So it's especially for goods that have limited geographic distributions. So if there's, say, a poison you need for an arrow, and it only grows on the trees right here, that's the kind of good that you're allowed to gamble on. You're not really allowed to gamble on something common or something you use in your everyday life. It's almost rare prestige goods. What did we see earlier in the talk? Rare prestige goods. So maybe this is a way that they were redistributed in Chacoan society. And it's a way for the Hadza to maintain an ethos of egalitarianism. I didn't take that from you. Luck brought it to me. And so if you have a society with trying to maintain the egalitarian ethos, this is an excellent way to shift goods around. You're stealing from people, but you're not overtly stealing. It's what Marshall Solins would call negative reciprocity. So sometimes this involved people, just as the stories about Chaco tell us. Great recent work by Kathy Cameron and graduate student Lindsay Johansson has shown that enslavement through gambling is pretty common throughout North America, particularly in the Northwest coast. But this was a real thing that would happen. If you bet all your things in a game and you lost, then you would wager yourself and then you would pay off your labor. But I really don't think it's a bad way to begin to think about, I don't want to say explaining, but begin to think about this situation of all the trees being brought into Chaco for construction. All of these goods, the utilitarian pottery, the Narbona pasture, with no clear material evidence for an export. Gambling is a way you accumulate things in exchange for nothing, or you gotta ante up to the house. And if you lose, maybe it's your job to go walk and cut down the trees from the chuscas and walk back to the canyon and quarry the stone and stack the stone, burning in the sun. Because this is an incredible amount of effort. Finally, there's sort of political, or what I would maybe call social status or competition aspects of gambling. Really, you're winning material goods, but a lot of the time what you're winning in a high-stakes gambling match is prestige. There's accounts from across North America of people battling with goods. I have here a quote of high-stakes gambling matches in which bets were raised and re-raised until huge amounts of wealth and property were wagered to challenge the prestige of an outright enemy was common across North America. So it's almost like a potlatch where, as a Quakiuto man said once, we don't fight with weapons, we fight with property. And we all have heard this phrase, Pax Chaco, the idea that there's less evidence for violence during the Chaco times than before or after. Well, maybe this is how people were fighting through gambling matches. And maybe this is how some people were developing status and prestige, living up on top of the hill in Guadalupe Great House, and other people were stuck down here in the humbler dwelling. A way to begin to understand this evidence of hierarchy, or at least social differentiation that we see in Chaco architecture and nutritional analyses, etc. So, thank you for listening, but I want to close with the fact that this is not, this is a living story. So this is an article from '97 in the Los Angeles Times about the debate that occurred on the Navajo Nation about the establishment of a casino. And many people, especially elderly medicine people, were very upfront about the fact that they knew what happens when gambling gets going. And they cited this story as a reason to avoid this. So this story is very alive, not just for what it can, tell us possibly about Chaco Canyon society and the exchange of goods, but as a central aspect in the moral knowledge, in the historical knowledge of descendant peoples. And then there's also, Hopi have a version of this story, and they still don't have a casino. Big part because of the traditions that are carried across in what happens if gambling goes wrong, or what it symbolizes. Gambling is about personal aggrandizement, accumulation of goods, things that the Pueblos today are so opposed to. You see this archaeological transformation post-Chaco of movement away from monumental architecture, these burials with great amounts of wealth, instead to a more communal layout of villages. And today the communal ethos of the Pueblos is second to none. And perhaps that shift that they made after Chaco is maybe literally marked by this story, shooting the gambler back into the sky, but also symbolically marked as rejecting a lifestyle based on the accumulation and social differentiation, etc. So thank you so much for your attention. I'd like to thank my advisors and these many people who have helped me along the way, and thank you all for coming and listening. I appreciate it. Happy to answer questions, yeah. Yes?
Why Chaco? What's in, I understand and everything you've said makes sense.
Thank you.
Why, but why, what did the landscape, or what is it about Chaco prior to, all of this forming that caused it to form there? Any clues, ideas?
Wow. This is the big question, and Anna Sofer and I have a paper on this very topic coming out in, well, it's been accepted. We're just waiting for the edition of the journal to come out. Basically, well, there's a lot of reasons probably. It's sort of a central place within the San Juan Basin. It's a basin within a basin.
Right.
You've got waterfalls that pour off the cliffs when there's heavy rainfalls. That's pretty cool. Depends who you ask. Some people think it might have been a pretty decent spot within the basin to grow corn. There were huge gatherings of basket maker peoples in the times before the this Great House period. For whatever reason, it looks like there's big seasonal gatherings of enormous basket maker villages, unlike any other basket maker sites in the Southwest. They're huge. The whole canyon was lined with basket maker pit houses. But that still doesn't tell us why they were cutting them. But I think, of course, is the topography. You've got Fajardo Butte is such a striking feature. Everyone I've ever driven into the canyon with gasps the first time they see it. But, well, I'll leave a little suspense maybe. But the canyon itself is, we've seen the alignments of the buildings. The canyon itself has a very special topographic alignment. That might have been, I think, you know, landscape is so central in the view of Pueblo people and indigenous people generally that a special formation of the landscape where the canyon itself is pre-aligned to the extreme position of the moon. Even though it might not be a great place to grow corn, it's got a short growing season, soil 37 times saltier than the most marginally productive fields at Hopi. You might go there to build your center of whatever this was a center of because of it was a special place on the landscape. So that's where my thinking is. I'm sure other people have many other ideas, but that's what we think, I think. Yes?
Has anyone explored whether there are other sites where these kinds of things were found, sensory stimulation and gambling? Because I'm thinking it's not unique to this site. Am I wrong?
Yes and no. Well, there are some of the exotica show up in other sites. So turquoise is all over the place. Shells pretty frequent. Macaws not so much. Copper bells. I mean, it's hard to say too because so few outliers have been excavated. I wouldn't be surprised if they were at outliers too. But I think just like everything at Chaco, the great houses are bigger, the roads are more formal, there's more exotica. So I think probably, but really they are pretty restricted. Conch shell trumpets, macaws, things like that. As for the gaming pieces, the bone dice are all over the Southwest. And I think that this, what I would say, social technology was used all over the Southwest for villages interacting with each other, exchange goods, meet people, play a game, maybe compete even. I don't know so much about the other pieces. Those sticks I call shinny sticks don't show up anywhere. Type 3 bonito sticks don't show up anywhere besides Pueblo Bonito. Again, they might still be buried in the ground. I haven't seen those sort of kick stick cylinders anywhere else either. So, of course, some of, it's not like all this stuff is just monopolized at Chaco, but I think a lot of it was. Very interesting, you made me think too. Bone dice become pretty infrequent in the ancestral Puebloan archaeological record following Chaco's decline. That has been documented. I'm going to try and document it now, because that was done a few years down the line. But I think that would be a very interesting parallel to the story, that maybe people stopped using gambling for divination, for economic exchange, because it kind of went wrong in Chaco. And the best evidence thus far does show a fall off in the occurrence of bone dice. They're very common before Chaco, they kind of start going down and then they go away. And then maybe they come back after a time, because we see them used, in ethnographic and modern Pueblos too. Thanks for the question. Yes, sir.
Is it your belief that the amount of labor that can be estimated to have created Chaco over the centuries could not have been produced simply by the population that was there permanently?
Wow. This is a very contentious question. I will give you my personal opinion, which is based on my assessment of looking at the data, and that's not to invalidate, I could be wrong. I mean, look at me, a child. So don't take anything I'm saying too seriously. But I think that there was a rather small resident population in the canyon. The main aspect of that is just the ability to not grow a lot of corn. I mean, they tried experiments during the Park Service excavations, and crops failed much more than they succeeded. And if you read records of the Navajo people who lived in Chaco, there was never more than a couple hundred at most. they could not produce a successful crop. And that's not to put down the ancestral Puebloans, it's to say, if they were looking for a good farming spot, they would have gone somewhere else. So there's that, there's the lack of wood in the canyon, even just wood for heating the rooms. Very few floor features and hearths in the buildings. Even though some people say, well, maybe they were more on upper story rooms, which is very good possibility, but the rooms that have been excavated have very few. And if they do have them, sometimes they're extremely small, and you've got rooms with 12-foot story ceilings, massive size. You're not going to heat it with something that small, especially in a canyon with no wood, where it gets 10 below, not uncommon. So anyway, and then there's questions of the mounds outside of great houses and what the depositional sequence of trash shows, and that's been debated. But again, it just doesn't seem like a lot of people are living there. It seems much more likely that just as timbers and pottery and stone are coming in from out of the canyon, labor is also probably coming in from outside the canyon. And I think it's a great idea, you know, Dr. Chip Wills at University of New Mexico has talked about the process of building the buildings themselves as a sort of ritual act, which I think is quite possible, or a gambling enslavement act. But I don't think that the few hundred people living in the canyon, maybe 1,000, maybe a couple thousand, still it's a lot of labor for just people who I think it would be very hard for the canyon to support. When you can live in much more wonderful places like the Chusca Slope. Chusca Slope is, you fly over there, you drive through there in the summertime, the Navajos are still growing corn up to here. Yes, sir?
Do you agree with Steve Lexman on the line between Pacame and Chaco and the north and south alignment?
The Chaco Meridian. What do I think about the Chaco Meridian? Well, I think that, yeah, sure, it could be that Chaco, I mean, Aztec is due north of Chaco, that's a fact, right? Pacame is due south of Chaco, that's a fact. I know people who have flown the proposed meridian from Chaco to Pacame, and there are very, very few sites on that line. That doesn't mean it couldn't exist. I don't know. I really don't have a strong opinion about the Pacame connection. I think Aztec is probably a successor, sort of, you know, Chaco 2.0. I think the North Road shows very clearly that the Chacoans were interested in symbolic constructions that marked directions, you know, so they made a clear statement. Here's Chaco, there's north, this is an important, you know, meridian, but whether it was like a movement of elites from Chaco to Aztec to Pacame, I don't know. But I think they were definitely interested in marking, you know, direction and probably having associations back to Chaco from Aztec. Maybe even up from Pacame. I gotta go to Pacame first. Gotta get one of those AAHS grants. Yes, sir.
What role do you think the small house sites played in the gambling story?
Great question. Well, I think, you know, pretty clear people were living in them. There's a lot of bone dice from them. So I think there was multiple scales. My vision of all this is that you might have, like in a pueblo today, you have a dance where, you know, the whole community is together and it's everybody, you know, that's like a big community or Chacoan world gambling match, like the Super Bowl or something. But I think also people were doing this on a smaller scale to exchange goods or just to have fun. So I think a lot of the bone dice that turned up in those small house sites were probably used in games that were not so restricted. So maybe you only played the kickstick race once or twice a year and it was sort of more corporately controlled. But bone dice games to exchange goods or to have fun or to, I mean, you look at a lot of cultures around the world, bone dice like that are used for informal divinations. So this is not a direct parallel, but I think it's very interesting. Delphi, Oracle of Delphi in ancient Greece, there's the official sort of corporate, if you will, oracle down, you know, at the Temple of Apollo. You hike up that hillside, there's a cave. In that cave, they found 25,000 bone dice. And that's where people would go for informal divinations. So I even think there could be a situation where the Chacoan elites or leaders or religious specialists, whatever term we want to use, are doing some more of an official gambling system, and then people across the canyon in the small houses are doing their own, at their own scale, non-controlled by the bigger society. And the distribution, especially with the bone dice, the distribution of those shows that pretty clearly, because like the kick sticks are in a real strong cache that suggests to me that's a controlled good and a controlled game. The shinny sticks are in a big controlled cache that I consider the same thing, but the bone dice are spread all over the place. So I think that was probably a game that was more of a, this is a totally ridiculous word, but more democratic game, if you will. Is there one more, or do we need to get out of here?